Tonight, we begin among the remarkable ruins and scandalous side streets of Pompeii, the ancient Roman city, frozen in ash and time. This was a place where even its brothels were carefully planned, thoughtfully decorated, and, surprisingly, impressively organized. So dim the lights, maybe switch on a fan for that gentle background hum, and let's ease into this journey together. Imagine you're a Roman merchant. You just sold a couple of amphorae of fish sauce, the kind that smells like it died twice, and you've got a few coins jingling inside your toga. There's that familiar itch for indulgence, the kind no amount of olives can satisfy. After a long day of Roman capitalism, you do what many men in Pompeii did. You follow the arrow, not a metaphorical one, a literal arrow. Carved directly into the paving stones is a relief of a penis, proud, pointed, and performing its civic duty by directing foot traffic toward the local lapaner. Subtle? Not even slightly. Effective? Absolutely. Even the most hopelessly lost Roman wouldn't miss it. Pompeii's city planners, clearly devoted to urban efficiency, designed their brothel navigation with the same logic they applied to bathhouses and bakeries. If you couldn't find it, you didn't deserve it. And honestly, with signage like this, you'd have to be blindfolded and on fire to miss your destination. You turn down a narrow alley. The noise of the street fades away. Fewer vendors shouting about garum, more whispered negotiations, and the occasional chuckle suggesting a transaction has wrapped up early. There are no children here, but cats, of course. There are always cats. Then you reach the entrance, a modest two-story building, dark stone walls, and a doorway that's far more inviting than you might expect. Above the lintel, there's another carving, a charmingly grotesque Prius with a feature so exaggerated it makes modern emoji look conservative. It's both a promise and a warning. Enter here, and you're stepping into a space where decorum is off-duty. A breeze carries the scent of wine, sweat, and something floral you can't quite place. Maybe lavender, maybe regret. And just as you prepare to walk in, another visitor exits, adjusting his tunic with the look of a man who's either very satisfied or trying to remember if he left his sandals inside. This isn't the elite's pleasure palace. This is a worker's delight. Direct, practical, and built for throughput. No couches, no flutes, just the Roman version of Next. Step inside the Lupanar, Pompeii's most infamous brothel. And the first thing that hits you isn't the decor. It's the practicality. There's no reception desk, no potted plants, no soft harp music, just a tight stone corridor. And the immediate realization that this place wasn't designed for lingering. It was designed for efficiency. The building has 10 rooms, or rather cells, each about the size of a modern-day coat closet. If your coat closet had a stone slab in the middle and wall paintings to explain what happens on it, the beds are made of carved masonry, which is only slightly more romantic than a park bench. In February, customers were expected to bring their own comfort, which usually meant a mat of straw, a blanket if they were fancy, and some creativity. Above each door is a fresco. Think of them as visual resumes. One might show a couple in a rather athletic pose. Another might depict a woman with her foot on a man's shoulder, which is either a service or a very niche sport. These paintings weren't for ambience. They were advertisements. Because in a city where literacy was optional, but libido was not, pictures got the point across faster than words. The rooms had no doors, just curtains if you were lucky. Privacy wasn't really the goal. Through the thin stone walls, you could hear everything. The groans, the coin clinking, the awkward apologies. It was a shared experience in the most uncomfortable way possible. And then there's the graffiti. Oh, the graffiti, says every archaeologist who's had to translate it while trying not to snort. Some is enthusiastic. Felix had a good time, others more specific. Matthew did it well. Occasionally, someone offered ratings. If Yelp had existed, the Lupanar would have had an average of 4 stars and a lot of very graphic reviews. The women here, most were enslaved, some freed. Their names were often aliases. Fortunata, crisis, successor. Names meant to evoke luck, beauty, or favorable outcomes. They weren't working here for fun, but they knew how to market themselves better than a modern startup. Forget paper menus. Forget waiters. Forget verbal consent with polite, small talk. In Pompeii's Lupanar, you simply glanced up at the wall and pointed. Above every room, Lining the corridors like risque billboards were fresco, hand-painted advertisements for services rendered. And by services, we mean, well, let's just say they left nothing to the imagination and everything to gravity. Each image was a Roman snapshot of acrobatic intimacy, like the Kama Sutra, but with fewer rules and more sandstone. The paintings were meant to inform, not arouse, though depending on your tolerance for awkward angles and stiff elbows, they may have accidentally done both. They depicted men and women, sometimes men and men or women and amour. We don't judge, in various enthusiastic arrangements. Some scenes were tender, others looked like someone had lost a bet with a contortionist. You might wonder, were these customized to match each working woman's specialties? Honestly, it's unclear. Some scholars believe they were generic. Others think the women pointed at their favorite fresco and said, "That one's 20 extra, darling." What's clear is that this was not a subtle business. This was visual, direct, and transactionally unambiguous. The client didn't have to negotiate. He could just point to fresco number 3, hand over his coin, and be gently ushered into a room with a stone bed and the faint echo of someone else's awkward silence next door. And here's the twist. The menu wasn't necessarily about sex. It was also about class. A wealthy Roman would never be caught dead in the Lupanar. He had his own private courtesans, flute girls, and probably a villa with its own scandalous wing. But this was for the working man, the fisherman, the baker, the guy who spent all day hauling bricks and now wanted 30 minutes of forgetfulness before dinner. For those men, the wall paintings were more than decoration. They were promises, dreams in faded red ochre. And like all dreams, slightly out of reach depending on your budget. Before there was Yelp, there was the wall. And in Pompeii's Lupanar, the walls were absolutely covered in reviews, carved, scratched, and scribbled with all the subtlety of a drunk Roman with a stylus and a grudge. Graffiti wasn't just tolerated, it was practically encouraged, turning the brothel into a running commentary of lust, ego, and questionable spelling. Step into any room, glance at the plaster, and boom, you've just stumbled into the ancient equivalent of the comment section. Some notes were brief and enthusiastic. "I screwed here," one man proudly proclaimed. No date, no context, just vibes. Others were oddly poetic. One graffito read, "Gas loves Daphne, but she prefers it with Marcus." Ouch, Gas, that one stings. It wasn't just the men leaving reviews. There are traces, possibly forged, possibly authentic, of women leaving notes, too. "Murtis was here," reads one, scrolled like a signature. Was she a client, a worker, a bored bystander waiting for her turn with the mirror? No one knows, but she made the wall. And then there were the critics. One noble soul left behind this gem. Thrusting is tiresome, short, brutally honest, possibly the world's first one-star review. Graffiti gave customers a chance to brag, vent, or just leave their name like a teenager tagging a bathroom stall. The range of emotions was rich. From a Vitus had successor, and she moaned delightfully to Meritus. "You cheated here." "I know." "Ah, yes." Even a drama made the walls. Archaeologists, bless their patient souls, have spent years translating these erotic Yelp reviews while trying to keep a straight face. Some inscriptions are scratched so deeply it's clear the writer meant every word. Others are faint, like someone had second thoughts mid-etching, possibly after remembering their wife also reads Latin. It's easy to forget, looking at those walls, that these weren't just reviews. They were human fingerprints. The Lupanar wasn't a place of passion. It was a workplace, a marketplace, and a message board all in one. Let's clear something up right away. The women working in the Lupanar weren't there because they filled out an application and dreamed of upward mobility in the hospitality sector. Most of them were enslaved. Some are former slaves trying to survive. And all of them were trapped in a system that made freedom a luxury and choice a fiction. Their names, or at least the ones scratched into the walls or remembered in wax tablets, read like mythological wishful thinking. Fortunata, the lucky one. Felix, the happy one. Successor, the successful. It's a bit like naming your pet turtle Susan Bolt and hoping he'll sprint. The reality behind the names was far grittier. These women came from all over the empire. Gaul, Greece, Egypt, plucked from conquered regions or desperate cities. They didn't share a common language. but they shared a job title and a daily routine that involved stone beds and strangers. Many were owned by a lino, the Roman term for a pimp, although that makes him sound cooler than he was. The lino was a glorified landlord, except the rooms came with unpaid labor and a quote. He collected the profits. The women collected, well, clients. If a woman was lucky, and by lucky we mean in a very bleak Roman sense, she could eventually buy her freedom. This took years of savings, sheer endurance, and a client or two who paid an actual denarii and not vague promises. Now, and then a freed woman might go into business for herself. These women were called meretrices, and while they still faced social scorn, they at least kept their earnings. They might even register officially and wear a stolard show they were no longer enslaved, because nothing says liberation like paperwork and uncomfortable formal wear. And don't forget the men. Yes, there were male sex workers in Pompeii, too, though far fewer, and usually working outside the lupanar. Their clients. Let's just say Roman aristocrats weren't as straight-laced as their busts might suggest. So, who were the workers? They were survivors, strangers in a city that promised pleasure, but delivered power imbalances carved into stone. And yet somehow they left their names behind, etched into the walls, immortal in fading graffiti. Because if history was going to forget them, they were at least going to write themselves into it first. So, you've pointed at your preferred fresco, handed over your coin, and been guided into a dim little stone room. You're not here for a long time. And let's be honest, you're probably not here for a good time either. That's because everything in the lupanar was built for speed, efficiency, and zero emotional entanglement. These were not luxurious suites with scented oil and feather pillows. These were cramped stone cells, each just large enough for two humans, a lamp, and whatever dignity you had left. Spoiler, it probably didn't make it out with you. The beds were stone slabs raised off the ground like altars to fleeting pleasure. If you were lucky, there was a mattress on top. If you were slightly less lucky, you got straw. If you were really out of luck, well, you got to contemplate life on bare volcanic rock like a naughty monk with performance anxiety. The average visit lasted about as long as it takes to unwrap a piece of cheese. That's not just a joke. Roman graffiti literally mocks clients who took too long. The goal wasn't to woo. It was to move. Fast in, fast out. Next customer, please. The speed was partly economic. Time is money. And when you're running a business with 10 rooms and a long line of sweaty bricklayers outside, turnover matters. But it was also cultural. Romans didn't romanticize brothel visits. This wasn't the setting for sweeping violins and candle-lit passion. This was plumbing the depths of desire with all the grace of a stampede. Privacy minimal. Doors were often just curtains, and the walls were thin enough that you could hear your neighbor's review in real time. And yet somehow people kept coming back. Maybe it was the thrill. Maybe it was loneliness. Or maybe the stone beds just gave excellent lumbar support. Who's to say? One could argue that the whole lupanar was a machine, an ancient Roman vending machine for intimacy. Drop in a coin, make your selection, and hope you don't run into your cousin on the way out. And yet, despite the rushed mechanics, there was something strangely human about it. Even if that humanity was wrapped in linen, sarcasm, and the constant sound of someone fumbling with a toga. Now let's talk brass tacks, or in this case, bronze coins rubbed smooth by nervous fingertips. If you were a Roman citizen with a bit of spare change and a lot of unmet needs, a visit to the lupanar wasn't exactly bank-breaking. The standard fee hovered around 2 to 8 asses. And no, that's not a typo or a euphemism. And as was a low-value Roman bronze coin, roughly the cost of a loaf of bread or a cup of cheap wine. So yes, a session at the brothel could be cheaper than a night at the tavern, though arguably far more complicated. The most common price tag, 2 asses. That's right, 2 small coins for one very rushed encounter. Some clients joked that they paid more for olives, and they weren't wrong. Now, don't let the pricing structure fool you. This wasn't the ancient world's version of a Costco deal. The reason it was cheap is because the workers weren't being paid, at least not directly. Most were enslaved, and the coins went straight into the lino's pocket. If the woman was lucky enough to keep a cut, she could try to save for her eventual freedom. If not, she just earned money for someone else's wine jug. The payment process was swift and impersonal. You'd likely hand over your coins at the entrance or to the woman herself, depending on the setup. There were no receipts, no tokens, and certainly no loyalty cards. The only membership benefit was maybe getting to cut the line if you were a frequent flyer with good manners. Interestingly, some brothel even had price lists painted or carved into the walls, complete with frescoes showing what you got for what you paid. Think of it as the world's oldest and least subtle value menu. And no, there were no combo deals. You paid a la carte. And just like any business, there were premium options. If you wanted privacy, a softer bed, red straw, or someone who could speak your language, the price might creep up to 5 or even 8 asses. Still cheaper than a decent haircut today, and probably just as awkward. If you're picturing the Lupaner as some candle-lit perfume temple of passion with silk sheets and hot towels, let's pop that fantasy like a Pompeian pimple. Let's start with the basics. Water. The Lupaner didn't have running water in the rooms. No basins, no bathhouse attached, just you, your toga, a stone slab, and a fervent wish that the person before you had the decency to wipe. Public bathhouse did exist in Pompeii, and they were quite sophisticated. Heated floors, cold plunges, even steam rooms, but the Lupaner was not one of them. This was strictly a one-function facility, and that function was not sanitation. The stone beds wiped down if you were lucky, possibly with water, possibly with the same rag used on all 10 beds. There's no record of disinfectant, unless you count the volcanic ash that later buried the place. Most likely, a quick sprinkle and a silent prayer to Venus did the trick. As for protection, forget about it. Romans didn't have latex. They had linen sheath, animal bladders, or just good old-fashioned reckless optimism. Some graffiti suggests that diseases were rampant, though like everything else, they made jokes about it. There's a certain resilience in turning venereal misfortune into bathroom humor. One famous line scratched onto a wall reads, "I paid 2 asses and got burning as a souvenir. Thanks, successor." That's not just a complaint. It's a Yelp review with medieval energy. The scent inside the Lupaner, likely a mix of sweat, oil, wine, incense, desperation, and maybe a faint note of plaster. It's a wonder people made it past the threshold without gagging. But Romans had different phylactery standards. This was, after all, a culture that used fermented fish sauce on everything. And don't forget the flies. With all that body heat and minimal ventilation, the Lupaner was a bug's paradise. Imagine trying to focus while a mosquito lands on your thigh mid-transaction. Talk about killing the mood. If you thought brothel in ancient Pompeii were limited to a single dingy floor with groaning stone slabs and echoing regrets, think again. The Lupaner, the most famous of Pompeii's brothel, came with 2 full stories. Because even in ancient Rome, real estate was all about vertical expansion. The ground floor was where the magic, and by magic we mean brisk economic transactions, happened. 10 small rooms lined a narrow hallway, each furnished with a stone bed and just enough space for 2 consenting or at least cooperating adults. This was the high traffic zone. Quick, cheap, no nonsense. A bit like a fast food drive-thru, except with sandals and fewer pickles. But the upper floor, that was for the elite clientele. The ones who had a few more coins jangling in their tunics, and maybe expected their chosen companion to know a little Greek, the language, or the style. Upstairs, things were quieter, slightly more refined. Maybe a cushion here or a curtain there. Ambience, accessed via a stone staircase that likely doubled as a tripping hazard after too much wine. The second floor may have hosted longer engagements, repeat clients, or simply those who didn't want to bump elbows with a dozen sweaty sailors waiting their turn downstairs. The extra privacy came at a cost, of course, but nothing says I care quite like buying 5 extra minutes on a straw bed with a better view. The upper rooms may also have served as living quarters for some of the women, or at least a place to collapse after a long shift. It's unclear how strictly the floors were divided by purpose, but archaeologists have noted the remains of a latrine on the second floor. Whether this counts as a luxury feature or just a convenience depends on your feelings about shared bathroom space and the Roman approach to plumbing. Spoiler, involved buckets. Interestingly, the Lupaner's 2-story structure also helped advertise its services. The painted signs outside were clearly visible from the street, and with the right lighting and a hint of perfume, the brothel almost seemed inviting from a distance. Visiting the Lupaner wasn't a silent, introspective experience. It was more like trying to have a very personal moment in the middle of a fish market. Pompeii was a noisy city. Streets bustled with vendors shouting out the virtues of their olives, garum sellers sloshing fermented fish sauce, and blacksmiths pounding out the soundtrack of ancient capitalism. If you were trying to sneak into the brothel unnoticed, good luck. The clatter of your sandals on the stone pavement already announced your arrival to half the neighborhood. Once inside, the walls weren't soundproof. Far from it. The rooms in the Lupanar were little more than closets, separated by thin masonry and the Roman equivalent of wishful thinking. Every cough, grunt, groan, or unexpected joke echoed from room to room. If you were shy, you left that at the door or drowned it in cheap wine. Outside, donkey carts rumbled by, and the occasional Roman citizen might stumble past, yelling a drunken ode to Venus, or arguing over who'd stolen their sandals. Children played, taverns clanged, and musicians with questionable talent wailed on pipes. It was like trying to concentrate during a street parade, except the parade never ended, and everyone smelled vaguely of sweat and seafood. Oh, and let's not forget the upper-level commentary. Sometimes wealthier clients upstairs would have a better auditory vantage point, and they used it. One can imagine a smug merchant reclining on a straw mat, wine in hand, chuckling at the performance art unfolding below, free entertainment included. In the rare quiet moments, perhaps during siesta hours, you might catch the cooping of doves, the shuffle of feet in the atrium, or the distant rhythm of gladiator training at the amphitheater. Even the gods, it seemed, had to deal with background noise. And of course, there was the internal soundtrack, your own heartbeat, probably racing, especially if this was your first visit. Combined nerves, ambient chaos, and questionable acoustics, and you've got the Roman sensory experience in full stereo. You might imagine that Roman brothel operated in some shadowy legal gray zone, tucked in dark alleys, constantly raided by toe-gearing vice squads. But no, in ancient Pompeii, sex work wasn't just tolerated, it was regulated. Let's start with the licensing. Yes, to be a professional courtesan or meretrix, if we're being properly Latin, you needed to be officially registered. Your name was entered into the Roman tax system, and just like bakers or blacksmiths, you were expected to pay your dues. That's right, the empire always got its cut, even from the oldest profession. In fact, sex work was so normalized that brothel was sometimes state-sanctioned. This was a government that taxed urine after all. Regulating pleasure was hardly a stretch. The Lupanar operated openly, its location no secret. If you wanted to shut it down, you'd have to also shut down half the taverns, Bat House, and probably the Senate itself. But don't mistake legality for dignity. Sex workers were considered infames, a legal category just below citizen with any rights at all. They couldn't testify in court, own property, or marry respectable Romans. Essentially, you could sleep with them, but heaven forbid you respect them. If a dispute did arise, say a drunken sailor shorted his bill, or a client got too handsy in a non-contractual way, the brothel's owner, Lino, might take it up with the local magistrate, but the women rarely had a voice in such matters. Legal protections were, let's call them, decorative. There were laws against certain abuses, but enforcement was spotty. You could theoretically be fined for harming a prostitute, but only if she was registered and the damage interfered with her ability to work. Yes, the Roman version of workers' comp. And what about the moralists? The ancient pearl clutches. They existed. Sure, writers like Juvenal and Seneca occasionally wagged their fingers about declining virtue, but their concerns were aimed more at respectable men behaving badly, not at the brothel itself. In short, it wasn't the Lupanar that offended. It was the senators caught sneaking out of it. You might think that ancient Roman religion and brothel were like oil and vinegar, best kept separate, unless you're making a very questionable salad. But in Pompeii, gods and lust were often on speaking terms, sometimes loudly with incense. Let's begin with Venus, the goddess of love, beauty, and highly selective morals. As the city's patron deity, her presence was everywhere. Temples, mosaics, amulets, and yes, brothel. If you wanted a bit of divine flair with your transactional visit, there was likely a little shrine to Venus watching over your performance. Encouraging? Perhaps slightly unsettling? Absolutely. In fact, some sex workers prayed before work, not for better conditions, but for more clients, generous tips, or simply a quieter neighbor in the next room. Offerings to Venus or Priapus, god of fertility, and comedic phallic sculptures weren't uncommon. You might light a candle next to a mural of a grinning god holding, let's just say, an intimidating staff. But religion didn't just bless the trade. It was deeply embedded in it. Fertility cults and rites tied to sexual expression weren't taboo in the way modern sensibilities might assume. In fact, some Roman festivals made Mardi Gras look like a church picnic. The boundary between sacred and scandalous was at best a loose guideline. Take Prius, often painted on walls or carved into garden statues with proportions that defy physics and subtlety. His presence was meant to ward off evil, bring luck, and quite literally stand guard over properties. And when he appeared in the Lupanar, it wasn't just decoration. It was protection and branding. There's also the odd overlap of ritual purity. Roman religion wasn't always bothered by sex, per se, but it was very particular about who touched what, when, and in what order. Visiting a brothel didn't make you impure, unless you then wandered into a temple without washing, in which case the gods might judge you, not for your activities, but for your hygiene. The Lupanar had seen its share of drama, drunken brawls, awkward exits, maybe a few toga malfunctions, but nothing could prepare it for the morning of August 24th, 79 CE, when Mount Vovius woke up on the wrong side of the tectonic bed. It started subtly, a distant rumble, a puff of smoke. Patrons might have assumed it was a rowdy tavern party or some overzealous street theater troupe doing a Wrath of the Gods reenactment. After all, what better place to ignore ominous signs in a city where the walls moaned louder than the earth? But then the sky turned black at noon. Not metaphorically, literally black. Birds stopped singing, dogs howled, and ash began falling like morbid confetti. Inside the Lupanar, business likely ground to a halt. Not because of a sudden attack of morals, but because volcanic pebbles began raining on the tile roof. Conversations turned from pricing to panicking. That sultry moaning in the background. Now, probably just someone yelling, "Run!" The brothel's architecture, sturdy but cramped, was no match for Vovius's rage. As the pyrolastic surges swept through Pompeii, superheated gases and volcanic debris engulfed the streets at over 100 mph. It wasn't the fire that got most people. It was the heat. Instant, invisible, inescapable. What's haunting is what was left behind. In the ruins of the Lupanar, archaeologists found remains curled in corners, slumped on stairs, caught mid-flee. People didn't always make it out. Some might have hesitated to grab their money pouch or cloak. Others might have just thought, how bad could it be? Famous last thoughts. When the ash finally settled, Pompeii was preserved in eerie detail, like a paused documentary of Roman life. Graffiti frozen mid-insult, food still on plates, and in the Lupanar, stone beds, erotic fresco, and the ghost of human desire, all entombed beneath 20 feet of volcanic tantrum. Ironically, it was this disaster that gave us our clearest glimpse into ancient life. Without the eruption, the brothel would have decayed like the others. Instead, it became a museum of sin, commerce, and raw humanity. As if the gods said, let's save this one for educational purposes. Imagine being a 19th century archaeologist full of dreams about noble Roman forums and grand marble statues, only to uncover a building where every wall seems to be moaning in Latin. Welcome to the Lupanar excavation. The brothel was officially unearthed in the 1860s, and let's just say the reactions were mixed. On one hand, you had scholars excited about discovering a well-preserved Roman building. On the other, you had uptight Victorians clutching their pearls as they realized every wall was basically a stone-carved OnlyFans. The frescoes, unapologetically graphic. The graffiti, equal parts crude and clever. The stone beds, small, narrow, and about as romantic as a dentist's chair. But it was the sheer honesty of the space that made it fascinating. Nothing was sugar-coated. The Romans weren't hiding their libido behind metaphors. They slapped it on the walls with artistic pride and a stunning lack of censorship. Of course, early excavators weren't quite sure how to present this cultural gem. Some pieces were hidden away in the so-called secret cabinet in Naples, a kind of NSFW ancient art vault where embarrassed museum curators could lock away anything too scandalous for polite society. The idea was simple: preserve the art, but only let serious men with scholarly intentions take a peek. Wink wink. Meanwhile, academics argued over the proper tone to take. Was this anthropology or smut? Were the frescoes symbolic or instructional? And most importantly, who was going to explain this to visiting school groups? Despite all the awkwardness, the Lupanar became one of Pompeii's most visited sites. Not because tourists were perverts, though let's not rule that out, but because it told a story unfiltered by myth or marble. This was real Roman life on the margins, now front and center in the tourist brochure. Even today, new insights emerge from the brothel's walls about class, gender, labor, and how humans have always found ways to mix business with pleasure, no matter the century. So, yes, the Lupanar is a bit awkward, a bit raw, but also strangely human. Because if there's one thing the ashes couldn't hide, it's the fact that history isn't just made by emperors and generals. Sometimes it's written in graffiti above a stone bed in a tiny room with terrible lighting. The year was 1119, and Jerusalem was once again in Christian hands. After the blood-soaked triumph of the First Crusade 2 decades earlier, waves of pilgrims streamed from Europe into the Holy Land. They were not knights, not warriors, not men of steel and banners, but humble believers. Peasants, artisans, widows, and monks walked for weeks and months, sometimes barefoot, clinging to the hope that touching the sacred stones of Jerusalem would cleanse their souls and grant them eternal salvation. But their journey was anything but holy. The roads were narrow, winding, and filled with dangers lurking in every valley. Along the road from Jaffa to Jerusalem, pilgrims faced ambushes by brigands who knew that these travelers carried coins, relics, and offerings for the churches. Muslim raiding parties, angered by the Crusader conquest, prowled the highways. Even fellow Christians, turned to banditry by poverty, preyed upon the faithful. The irony was bitter. The closer you came to the land of Christ, the more likely you would die with a dagger in your ribs or find your possessions stripped away in the dust. Chroniclers of the time paint a stark picture. Pilgrims were beaten, stripped, and left to rot along the roadside. Some were dragged away as hostages, sold into slavery in distant markets. Others never made it at all, vanishing into the hills between the coast and the holy city. For many Europeans, the dream of salvation became a nightmare of blood and despair. The rulers of Jerusalem, first Baldwin, later his cousin Baldwin II, understood the problem well. Without safe passage, the lifeblood of the kingdom would dry up. Pilgrims brought not only faith, but coin, labor, and legitimacy to the fragile crusade estates. But Jerusalem's armies were stretched thin, its fortresses scattered, and its knights too few to guard every pilgrim. Something new was needed, a brotherhood of men willing to live not for land or gold, but for the defense of the defenseless. It was in this crucible of danger that the seed of the Knights Templar was planted. A handful of knights poor in wealth, but rich in devotion would rise to take an oath not only to God, but to the weary, terrified pilgrims trudging toward Jerusalem. Their mission was simple, but revolutionary: to fight so that others might pray in peace. In 1119, amid the dust and uncertainty of the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem, a small band of knights gathered with a bold idea. They were not lords of vast estates or commanders of mighty armies. They were men who had once lived for the clash of battle and the honor of war, but who now felt called to a higher purpose. At their head was Hug D, a knight from Champagne in France, whose vision was as sharp as his sword. By his side stood Godfrey de Santo, and together they convinced 7 others to bind themselves in an oath unlike any Europe had ever seen. They would live as monks, but monks with swords. Their vows echoed the strict discipline of monastic life: poverty, chastity, and obedience. Yet, unlike the Benedictines who prayed in cloisters, these men would take their prayers onto the road where danger was constant. They called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, a title that sounded humble, yet carried an aura of divine fire. The world would later shorten it simply to the Knights Templar. At first, their number seemed laughable: 9 knights to guard thousands of pilgrims traveling across a kingdom scarred by war. They had no fortresses, no treasure, and no banner to rally behind. But they had faith, and faith was a currency more valuable than coin in the medieval imagination. Chroniclers recorded that they swore to dedicate their swords only to defense, never to plunder, never for personal glory. In a world where knights often blurred the line between crusader and bandit, this vow marked them as something utterly new. King Baldwin II, ruling Jerusalem at the time, recognized their zeal. He granted them quarters within the sacred precincts of the Temple Mount in what had once been part of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Christians believe this site was none other than the ruins of Solomon's temple, where God's presence had once dwelled to live and pray. There was not only a privilege, but a sign that these warriors carried a mission of biblical proportions. For the pilgrims stumbling up the perilous road from Jaffa, the sight of a mounted knight in white cloak and cross was more than reassurance. It was a living symbol that God had not abandoned them. The Templars' beginnings were humble, but in their humility lay a strength that would one day make them the most feared and powerful order in Christendom. The Templars began as little more than a noble experiment. 9 men with swords and a vow. But an experiment cannot survive long without structure. And structure came in the form of one of the most influential churchmen of the age, Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard was no ordinary monk. He was a Cistercian abbot, a reformer, and one of the most persuasive voices of the 12th century. When he spoke, kings listened, and when he wrote, the church followed. In 1129, at the Council of Troyes in France, the fledgling brotherhood was formally brought before the highest authorities of the church. Hug D himself stood to present the Templars' mission. They were poor. They had no lands, and their order was unlike any monastic tradition that had come before. But Bernard saw potential in them. Potential not only for service, but for salvation. He argued that these men, by combining the humility of monks with the courage of knights, embodied a new kind of holiness. Under Bernard's guidance, the Templars received their rule, a written code of life that transformed them from a ragtag band into an official religious order. It was modeled after the strict Cistercian discipline. Silence in the halls, simple meals without extravagance, no luxuries of clothing or gold. Their armor was plain, their cloaks white as a sign of purity, and their diet restricted even in times of war. They were to avoid pride, gluttony, and above all, personal ambition. In short, the rule sought to strip away everything worldly, leaving behind only men wholly devoted to God and the protection of his pilgrims. Yet, there was a paradox at the heart of the rule. These monks were not called to flee the world, but to fight in it. Bernard himself resolved the tension in a fiery treatise titled In Praise of the Newhood. Traditional knights, he wrote, fought for vanity, for wealth, or for the applause of men. But the Templars fought for Christ himself. Their battlefield was their monastery, their sword, an instrument of prayer. When a Templar killed, Bernard claimed, it was not murder, but Mollycide, the destruction of evil itself. The rule gave the Knights Templar a soul, and Bernard's words gave them legitimacy. What began with 9 men now became an institution, recognized by the Pope, admired by the faithful, and feared by those who stood in their way. With Bernard of Clairvaux's blessing and papal recognition, the Knights Templar transformed almost overnight from a fragile experiment into a phenomenon. What began with 9 men now spread across Christendom like wildfire. By the mid-12th century, nobles, lords, and kings across Europe rushed to support the order. Some donated land, others wealth, and many gave their own sons, often younger sons who had no inheritance, but craved both purpose and salvation. The Templar image became iconic. Knights clad in white mantles marked with a stark red cross, riding two to a horse in humble acknowledgement of their vow of poverty. Yet their poverty was paradoxical, for while the individual knight owned nothing, the order as a whole amassed vast resources. Castles in Spain, farms in France, vineyards in Portugal, and estates in England all fell under the Templars' management. Pilgrims leaving for the Holy Land might sell or donate property to the order, and wealthy nobles eager to curry divine favor left entire villages in Templar hands. This sudden influx of wealth and land did not weaken their discipline. It fueled their mission. In the Holy Land, the Templars built fortresses that would become legendary. Safe Tortosa and the seemingly impregnable Crac de Chevalier. From these strongholds, they patrolled the dangerous roads, guarded ports, and fought alongside Crusader kings against Muslim armies. Their reputation on the battlefield grew quickly. Disciplined, fearless, and unwilling to retreat, the Templars often held their ground when others fled. But it wasn't just swords and castles. The Templars also pioneered something entirely new for medieval Europe: a network of financial support. Pilgrims traveling from London to Jerusalem could deposit money in a Templar precept in England and withdraw the equivalent in the Holy Land, sparing themselves the danger of carrying gold across hostile lands. It was a system so advanced that some historians call it the first international banking network. By the middle of the 12th century, the once humble poor fellow soldiers of Christ had become one of the most powerful institutions in Europe. They were monks, yes, but monks who could marshal armies. They were poor, yes, but richer than kings. Their rise was meteoric, and it was only the beginning. If the white mantle and red cross made the Templar instantly recognizable, it was on the battlefield that their reputation was carved into legend. By the mid-12th century, they had become the shock troops of the Crusade estates, a brotherhood bound not just by vows, but by the willingness to die shoulder to shoulder. Templar knights were trained to fight with a discipline that stood out in an age when battles often devolved into chaotic melees. They rode into combat in tight formations, their lances lowered like a wall of steel. When the Order's banner, the basant, was raised, no Templar was permitted to flee so long as it still waved. This rule, born of their sacred code, meant that they often held the line long after ordinary knights would have broken. Chroniclers tell us that when other armies scattered, the Templars stayed, sometimes to the last man. Their valor earned admiration, even from enemies. Muslim chroniclers, while condemning the Crusaders as invaders, noted the ferocity of the white monks who charged into battle with terrifying resolve. At battles such as Monte Sad in 1177, where a vastly outnumbered Christian force stunned Saladin, the Templars' courage was decisive. Saladin himself, the great Sultan of Egypt and Syria, reportedly remarked that while most Crusaders could be crushed, the Templars were made of sterner stuff. Inside the order, brotherhood ran deep. Each knight swore not only to God, but to his brothers in arms. They ate together in silence, trained together, and died together. Even their burial reflected equality, in plain graves without gilded tombs or ornate monuments. Their identity was communal, not personal, knights of Christ rather than knights of their own glory. Yet this discipline came at a cost. The Templars were expected to obey without hesitation. To retreat without orders was a grave sin. Many knights perished not because victory was possible, but because the rule demanded unshakable loyalty to the order's banner. This stubbornness sometimes led to devastating losses, but also cemented their fearsome mystique. By the late 12th century, the Templars were no longer merely guardians of pilgrims. They had become an elite warrior caste, equal parts monks and soldiers, feared by foes and admired by allies. In the crucible of constant war, their brotherhood was forged in blood and bound by unbreakable vows. Though remembered for their swords and their vows, the Knights Templar also wielded a quieter but equally formidable weapon: money. By the mid-12th century, their reputation for honesty and discipline made them trusted stewards of wealth across Christendom. Lords, kings, and even common pilgrims turned to the order not only for protection, but also for financial security. A pilgrim setting out from Paris or London might deposit his savings at a local Templar commandery. In return, he received a coded letter of credit, a slip of parchment indecipherable to outsiders, which he could later redeem in Jerusalem for the same amount. This spared him the peril of carrying gold through bandit-ridden lands. To a medieval world accustomed to theft and dishonesty, the system was revolutionary. The Templars, with their far-flung network of castles and prectories, had created what was effectively the first international banking service. Their financial reach extended far beyond pilgrim accounts. Monarchs too relied on the order. The kings of Aragon, England, and France entrusted Templars with their treasuries, knowing that no chest of coin would vanish under the white cloak. They financed crusading campaigns, collected rents on vast estates, and even acted as money lenders, though they did so carefully, sidestepping accusations of usury by charging fees rather than interest. The Templars' Paris headquarters, known as the Temple, became a financial hub so secure that even kings could not touch the wealth stored within. England's King Henry III used the Temple as his personal treasury. Popes relied on Templar funds to finance their wars and diplomatic missions. For nearly 2 centuries, their system made them indispensable to rulers who found themselves constantly short of cash but flush with ambition. Paradoxically, their vow of poverty was what gave them credibility. While individual knights owned nothing, not even the horses they rode, the order as a whole became staggeringly rich. They invested in farms, mills, vineyards, and ports. Their network stretched from the wheat fields of England to the olive groves of Cyprus. The profits did not line personal pockets, but flowed back into the mission, defending the Holy Land and sustaining the order's warriors. But with wealth came whispers. How could men sworn to poverty wield more money than many kingdoms? How could monks in armor also act as Europe's bankers? These questions, first murmured in markets and taverns, would one day fuel suspicion, envy, and ultimately destruction. By the late 12th century, the Knights Templar stood at the heart of the Crusader struggle, and their greatest adversary was one of the most formidable figures of the medieval world, Saladin. Sultan of Egypt and Syria, Saladin was both a brilliant commander and a shrewd statesman. His rise posed an existential threat to the fragile Crusader states, and the Templars often found themselves directly in his path. The first great confrontation came in a series of raids and counter-raids across Palestine. The Templars were relentless defenders of the frontier, garrisoning castles and patrolling roads where Saladin's forces sought to undermine Christian control. Their discipline and refusal to retreat made them a thorn in the Sultan's side. Muslim chroniclers, even while condemning them as infidels, acknowledged the Templars' unmatched courage. Saladin himself reportedly called them the most dangerous of his enemies, noting that they fought to the death with a fanaticism difficult to overcome. But bravery could not always triumph against strategy. In 1187, the fragile Crusader kingdom suffered its most catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Hattin. The Templars rode at the forefront, but the Christian army, trapped without water under the blazing July sun, was annihilated. Nearly every knight was slain or captured. The Templar Grand Master Gerard d'Ereport fell into Saladin's hands. In an act meant to break the spirit of Christendom, Saladin ordered the execution of hundreds of captured Templars and Hospitallers, sparing only a handful who converted to Islam. For the order, it was a massacre that seared itself into their collective memory. Yet, the Templars were not destroyed. Within months, they regrouped, manning the fortresses that still resisted Saladin's advance. At the Siege of Tyre and later at Acre, they played a crucial role in keeping a Crusader foothold in the Levant. When King Richard the Lionheart arrived for the Third Crusade, it was the Templars who fought beside him, charging into battle with the same iron resolve that had earned them both admiration and fear. The clash with Saladin revealed both the glory and the fragility of the Templar mission. They were fearless, yes, but not invincible. Their willingness to die on the battlefield, while inspiring, also bled the order of its finest warriors. Still, their resilience ensured that even after Hattin, the Red Cross continued to fly in the east. The 13th century marked the beginning of a slow unraveling for the Knights Templar. Once hailed as saviors of pilgrims and champions of Christ, they now faced a series of blows that eroded their strength, reputation, and very purpose. The first challenge was military. The Crusader kingdoms that the Templars had sworn to defend were crumbling. After the disastrous loss at Hattin and the fall of Jerusalem to Saladin, the Crusaders clung to a handful of ports and fortresses along the coast. The Templars poured their resources into defending these outposts, but one by one they fell. Acre, the last major Christian stronghold in the Holy Land, was lost in 1291 after a brutal siege. Thousands of Templars died in its defense, and those who survived retreated to Cyprus, exiled from the land that had given them their original mission. But geography was not their only problem. Perception was changing, too. With no Holy Land to protect, many in Europe began to ask, what was the point of the Templars now? Their vast estates, castles, and wealth remained, but their visible purpose seemed gone. Pilgrims no longer needed escorts to Jerusalem. Jerusalem itself was lost. To kings desperate for money and power, the order's riches looked less like sacred trust and more like tempting plunder. Accusations began to swirl. Whispers claimed the Templars had grown arrogant, that they had dabbled in secret rituals, that their vows masked corruption. Their role as Europe's bankers, once a service, now bred resentment. Lords indebted to them sneered at their poverty, while envying their prosperity. Even monarchs who had relied on them began to fear their independence. Unlike other orders, the Templars answered only to the Pope. They paid no taxes, owed allegiance to no king, and operated across borders with a freedom few rulers could tolerate. The final spark came from Philip the Fair, King of France. Crushed under debt to the Templars, Philip saw both opportunity and danger in their continued existence. He began a campaign of rumor and suspicion, suggesting that these warrior monks were heretics who mocked Christ and secret rites. Whether believed or not, the idea took root, feeding on jealousy and fear. The once unshakable order now found itself under a shadow. Their castles still stood, their coffers were still full, but the foundation of trust, the faith of Christendom in their mission, was cracking. The stage was set for betrayal. The dawn of Friday, October 13th, 1307, shattered the order's centuries of power. Acting on the orders of King Philip the Fair of France, royal officers stormed Templar prectories across the kingdom. Hundreds of knights were arrested in a single coordinated strike. The charges were shocking. Heresy, idolatry, blasphemy, secret rites, even obscene initiation rituals. To a medieval audience, these accusations were damning whether or not they were true. Philip's motives were plain. He was bankrupt, weighed down by the debts he owed to the Templars. By destroying them, he could erase what he owed and seize their wealth. But to succeed, he needed more than greed. He needed legitimacy. And so, the Templars were dragged before inquisitors, tortured until they confessed to crimes they almost certainly did not commit. Under the lash and the rack, men admitted to spitting on the cross or worshiping strange idols. The confessions were paraded as proof, even though many knights later recanted, declaring their innocence before God. At first, the Pope Clement V hesitated. The Templars had long been under papal protection, answerable to no king. But Philip's pressure was relentless, and the scandal threatened to undermine the church itself if left unresolved. In 1312, under political duress, Clement officially suppressed the order at the Council of Vienne, dissolving the Knights Templar after nearly 2 centuries of existence. Their lands and wealth were in theory transferred to their rivals, the Hospitallers, but much of it conveniently found its way into royal coffers. The once feared warrior monks were scattered, some absorbed into other orders, others fading into obscurity. In Portugal, they re-emerged under a new name, the Order of Christ. But elsewhere, the Red Cross of the Templars vanished. The most dramatic moment came in 1314 when Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, was burned at the stake in Paris after retracting his forced confession. Chroniclers claim that as the flames consumed him, he called upon God to judge both Pope Clement and King Philip within the year, and indeed within months both men were dead. The legend of his curse echoed across Europe, casting a final haunting shadow over the order's end. The Knights Templar were gone, but their story did not end in ashes. Rumors of hidden treasures, secret knowledge, and underground survival gave them a second life in legend. From protectors of pilgrims to martyrs of politics, their rise and fall remains one of the most dramatic sagas of the Middle Ages. To imagine ancient Athens only as the city of Socrates and Plato is to miss the flavor of its daily life. Philosophy might have been debated in the shaded porticos of the Agora, but food was the real glue that bound the city together. At dawn, the streets of Athens stirred not with lofty speeches, but with the clatter of clay pots, the crackle of fires, and the cries of vendors hawking their goods. If you walked through the Agora in the 5th century BCE, you would be greeted by a symphony of scents. Roasted grains, salted fish, sweet honey drifting from stalls, and the constant buzz of people eating, buying, and talking. Street food was no afterthought. For the average Athenian, Meals at home were simple and sparse. Bread, olives, and cheese might sustain a family, but it was in the bustling streets that food became an experience. Vendors carried trays of snacks slung from their shoulders, ready to sell to anyone who passed. At corners near the marketplace, small stands with clay ovens turned out steaming loaves and roasted chickpeas. The poor, the wealthy, slaves, and citizens all mingled together in this edible theater of everyday survival. The agora itself was not just the political and economic heart of the city. It was its cafeteria. Philosophers might argue about virtue, but they did so while chewing figs or sipping watered-down wine. Couriers paused for a bite of bread dipped in oil, and laborers fresh from the docks satisfied their hunger with grilled sardines sold for a single coin. The hum of conversation mixed with the hiss of hot pans, creating an atmosphere that was as social as it was practical. For Athenians, food on the street carried no stigma. It was quick, communal, and often festive. A man could grab a handful of nuts on his way to the assembly or pause for honey cakes after attending a festival. Children darted between stalls, pestering vendors for scraps, while farmers arriving from the countryside bartered their goods for a taste of city cooking. Athens was, in short, a city that lived by its streets. The food there was not luxury, but rhythm, a daily beat of roasting, baking, and frying that nourished its citizens while binding them together in one bustling, flavorful community. If there was one food that embodied the daily life of ordinary Athenians, it was the humble chickpea. Vendors roasted them on flat pans over open flames, sprinkling them with a pinch of salt or herbs, and served them in little cones of papyrus. The aroma of toasted legumes drifted through the marketplace, luring passers-by to stop for a handful. They were cheap, filling, and packed with enough protein to sustain a laborer through a long day at the docks or in the fields. In a city where most people lived without wealth, roasted chickpeas were the true democratic snack, shared by everyone, from poor craftsmen to students of philosophy. But the chickpea was not eaten only roasted. Boiled and stewed with garlic, onions, or dill, it made a hearty porridge known to all social classes. A pot of chickpeas simmering slowly over the fire was a common sight in Athenian households, especially in the poorer districts where meat was a rare luxury. Chickpeas were also ground into flour to thicken soups, or mixed with barley to stretch a meal further. They were the backbone of survival food, plain, earthy, and reliable. Alongside chickpeas stood the lentil, another humble legume that earned pride a place in the Athenian diet. A bowl of lentil stew was often called the poor man's meat, but this was not an insult. Lentils were hearty, rich in flavor when stewed with vinegar and herbs, and they could be prepared quickly for those who had little time or money. Philosophers themselves were fond of them. A saying attributed to Socrates teases young men to content themselves with lentils rather than chase after extravagance. In this sense, lentils were not just food. They were a moral lesson in moderation and simplicity. On the streets, vendors might carry steaming bowls of lentils to sell to workers rushing between tasks. For a few coins, a man could buy sustenance that filled his stomach and warmed his body. The poor could live for days on lentils, bread, and olives, a trio that represented both the austerity and resilience of Greek life. Chickpeas and lentils were not glamorous, but they were dependable. They carried the taste of home, of thrift, of resilience. In a city famed for its philosophers and warriors, these humble legumes quietly kept Athens alive, one roasted cone or simmering pot at a time. In ancient Athens, bread was not merely food. It was the foundation of life. Without bread, there was no meal. Every household, from the poorest hut to the wealthiest villa, revolved around the grinding of grain, the kneading of dough, and the daily baking that kept bellies full. In fact, to eat bread was synonymous with eating itself. Most Athenians relied on barley bread, a coarse, dark loaf made from the hardier grain that thrived in Greece's rocky soil. Barley bread was dense and heavy, often described by aristocrats with a kind of disdain. But for the common citizen, it was filling and reliable. Wheat bread, finer and softer, was a luxury imported from regions like Thrace or Egypt. To eat white bread was to declare one's wealth. It was food for the privileged few, not for the majority. On the streets of Athens, bakers rose before dawn to prepare the city's daily bread. Ovens fired with olive wood and brush filled the air with a nutty, smoky fragrance that drifted across the agora. Vendors sold loaves hot from the hearth wrapped in cloth or leaves to retain warmth. A dock worker might break his loaf apart with his hands on the way to labor, dipping chunks into olive oil or wine for flavor. Children tore off pieces to nibble while running errands. And farmers arriving from the countryside often bought bread to eat alongside dried figs or cheese. Bread was rarely eaten plain. It was dipped into honey for sweetness, soaked in diluted wine, or used to scoop up stews of beans and lentils. Wealthier Athenians might sprinkle it with herbs, sesame, or cheese. There were even variations baked with onions or garlic, giving the loaves a pungent edge that filled the stomach and sharpened the senses. But bread was more than fuel. It was symbolic. In offerings to the gods, bread was laid upon altars. During festivals, special loaves shaped into coils or animals were baked as sacred gifts. Sharing bread was also a social act, a gesture of hospitality and community. To break bread with someone was to acknowledge trust and friendship. In every bite, bread carried the story of Athens, its soil, its laborers, its markets, and its gods. Whether barley dark or wheat white, humble or luxurious, bread was the thread that bound together survival and society in the streets of the ancient city. If bread was the foundation of the Greek diet, then fish was its flavor. In a land where the sea was never far away, the people of Athens turned to the waters for sustenance. The Ion was their pantry, supplying everything from humble sardines to prized tuna. On the streets of the city, fish was not reserved for feasts. It was everyday fare, sizzling over flames for anyone with a few coins to spare. The cheapest and most common fish were the small ones, sardines, anchovies, and sprats. Vendors skewered them on sticks or wrapped them in fig leaves, grilling them quickly over open charcoal braziers. The smell of charred fish skin wafted across the agora, drawing in workers and travelers alike. A dockhand or potter might buy a skewer of fish to eat on the go, tearing the flesh apart with his fingers and licking the salty oil from his hands. These little fish were affordable, nutritious, and above all portable, a perfect street snack in a busy city. Larger fish were another matter. Tuna, mullet, or sea bass could fetch a high price, and their arrival in the marketplace was often a spectacle. Wealthier citizens, or those seeking to impress guests, would buy whole fish to be roasted or baked with herbs. But even these delicacies found their way into the streets, where innkeepers or cooks sold slices to those who could afford a small taste of luxury. A single portion of grilled mullet crisped at the edges and drizzled with olive oil could transform an ordinary meal into something memorable. What made fish so essential was its variety. Salted and dried fish were staples for long journeys or poor households who needed preservation. Smoked fish gave a deeper flavor and lasted longer than fresh. Fish soups, seasoned with leeks and dill, were sold steaming from clay pots in the back streets, warming both body and spirit. Even the scraps and bones were boiled into broths that stretched a meal further, ensuring nothing went to waste. For Athenians, fish was more than food. It was culture. Plays and comedies from the era often joked about the frenzy in fish markets, where housewives haggled fiercely with sellers. To love fish was to be Greek, and to argue over its price was a civic duty. In the smoky stalls of Athens, with sardines hissing over coals, the city's appetite was satisfied one skewer at a time. If savory fish and bread sustained Athens through its daily rhythm, then honey cakes gave it joy. In a world without sugar, honey was the sole source of sweetness, a golden treasure harvested from hillside hives and revered as a gift from the gods. The Greeks called honey the nectar of the immortals, and on the streets of Athens, it transformed simple dough into irresistible treats. Vendors fried small rounds of wheat or barley batter in bubbling oil until they puffed and crisped. Once golden, they drizzled them with honey, letting the syrup seep into every crevice before sprinkling them with sesame seeds. These treats, what we might recognize as the ancestors of donuts, were sticky, fragrant, and addictive. Children ran to stalls with sticky fingers while adults savored them slowly, the honey clinging to lips and beards. But honey cakes were not only indulgences. They were deeply tied to ritual. At festivals honoring the gods, especially Zeus and Artemis, honey cakes were offered at altars. Sometimes they were shaped into animals or coils, their sweetness meant to please divine appetites. To eat what had first been offered to the gods was to share in a sacred meal, blurring the line between devotion and delight. At weddings and births, honey cakes symbolized prosperity and fertility, binding the cycles of life to the taste of sweetness. On ordinary days, though, honey cakes were pure pleasure. The agora buzzed with vendors who balanced trays on their heads, shouting out the freshness of their fried cakes. The smell alone was enough to lure passers-by from debates and trade deals. For a few OS, anyone could enjoy a moment of luxury, no matter how poor. A sailor just back from Piraeus might spend his wages on a fistful of cakes, while a philosopher, supposedly above such temptations, might secretly nibble one between lectures. The texture was part of the appeal. Crisp outside, soft inside, drenched in honey that glistened in the Athenian sun. Eating them was messy, but in a city that thrived on noise, argument, and laughter, no one cared if syrup dripped onto your tunic. In honey cakes, Athens revealed its sweeter side. They were food for the gods, food for the festivals, and food for the everyday man who wanted just a taste of golden joy in a life often filled with struggle. Not every street food in Athens required fire or frying pans. Some of the most beloved snacks were simple gifts of the earth. Figs, olives, and nuts. Together, they formed the everyday fuel of the city, portable, nourishing, and endlessly versatile. They were as common in the hands of a child as in the rations of a soldier, and they appeared in both humble suppers and lavish banquets. The fig was Athens' pride. Plump, sweet, and bursting with seeds, figs grew across Attica, and their harvest marked the rhythm of the year. Fresh figs were sold from woven baskets in the agora, their skins glistening purple or green. They were eaten whole, juice dripping down fingers, or paired with cheese for a richer bite. Dried figs flattened into leathery discs were even more popular. Easy to carry, long-lasting, and cheap. They were the snack of workers, travelers, and students. To eat figs was so integral to Greek identity that laws even forbade their export, keeping the finest fruits for Athenians alone. If figs were the sweetheart of Greek food, olives were its soul. Every Athenian grew up with them in one form or another. Black or green, pickled or cured. Olives were sold in heaps at market stalls, scooped into clay jars, and eaten by the handful. Olive oil pressed from these same fruits flavored nearly every dish. But the olives themselves were an essential street snack. Salty, tangy, and filling, they were carried in pockets or wrapped in leaves for quick bites. To eat an olive was to taste the land of Greece itself, rocky soil, hot sun, and centuries of cultivation. Nuts, too, had their place in Athenian life. Almonds, walnuts, and hazelnuts were cracked open and eaten raw or roasted, often sold in small piles by vendors at festivals. Children tossed them like dice in games before eating them, while adults carried them as travel food. Mixed with honey, nuts became a sweet, energizing treat, beloved by athletes for their strength, and by philosophers for their simplicity. Together, figs, olives, and nuts were more than food. They were a portable pantry, sustaining Athens at work, in play, and in worship. Sold cheaply on the streets, they embodied the balance of Greek eating. Simple, natural, and tied to the rhythm of the earth. No Athenian meal, whether in the streets or at home, was complete without something to drink. And for the Greeks, that almost always meant wine. But forget the modern image of gulping it straight from the emperor. Athenians considered drinking unmixed wine barbaric. Instead, they diluted it with water, often in a 3-to-1 ratio, turning strong wine into a refreshing beverage suited for daily life. To drink it pure was considered a mark of savagery, fit only for Thrians and other univilized peoples. In the agora and neighborhood taverns, large clay jars called craters were filled with watered wine. Vendors dipped cups into them, selling cheap portions to laborers who wanted to wash down bread or fish. The drink was sometimes flavored with herbs, spices, or even honey to mask the roughness of cheaper vintages. A sailor back from Piraeus might spend his coins on a cup of spiced wine, while a student of rhetoric might sip a watered drink while debating philosophy with friends. Street water sellers also played their part, carrying ampo from the city's fountains and springs. Water was plentiful in Athens thanks to aqueducts and cistern. And while it was not unsafe, Athenians generally preferred it mixed with a splash of wine. The combination was practical. It stretched the wine further, dulled its intoxicating power, and gave even ordinary water a sense of festivity. For those with a sweet tooth, another option was kaikon, a simple mixture of barley, water, and sometimes herbs or honey. Though more rustic, it was refreshing, filling, and particularly popular among farmers and soldiers. At religious festivals, kaikon even carried a sacred meaning tied to the rites of Dido and the Eleusinian mysteries. To drink it was not only to quench thirst, but to participate in tradition. Wine drinking was also deeply social. Even a humble street-side cup echoed the practices of the symposium, the Greek drinking party, where men reclined on couches, talking, singing, and debating under the influence of diluted wine. On the streets, Athenians did not lounge on cushions, but the same principle applied. Wine loosened tongues, forged connections, and turned a simple meal into a shared experience. For Athenians, watered wine was more than refreshment. It was culture in a cup. In every sip lay a blend of practicality, moderation, and community, echoing the balance that defined Greek life itself. If the agora was the beating heart of Athens, then its markets were the arteries through which food, voices, and energy flowed. Every day before dawn, the square filled with vendors setting up their stalls, arranging baskets of figs, amphit, slabs of cheese, and trays of roasted chickpeas. By mid-morning, the place was a riot of noise, smells, and colors. The food vendors of Athens were not merely salesmen. They were performers. Each one cried out with exaggerated claims, boasting that his honey was sweeter than the rivals, or that his fish was fresher, caught at dawn from the harbor at Pius. Housewives haggled fiercely, slapping coins down and demanding better prices. Philosophers complained about the noise, but often found themselves lured into buying snacks between lectures. Slaves skewered through the crowds, sent by their masters to gather provisions. The market was chaotic, but it was also the glue of the city, a place where every class mixed in pursuit of sustenance. Some vendors carried their goods through the streets rather than setting up stalls. Bakers balanced trays of flatbread on their heads. Nut sellers rattled small baskets to attract attention. Fishmongers dripped sea water onto their catch to keep it glistening and fresh. The poorer citizens could buy just a single sardine or a handful of olives, while the wealthy might purchase amphi of fine wine or large cuts of meat for household feasts. Markets were also places of innovation. Athenian cooks experimented with spices brought in from trade routes, offering flavored bread, seasoned stews, or fish grilled with herbs for those who could pay a little extra. The variety gave the streets an international flavor. Egyptian grain, Thracian wine, and Anatolian nuts sat side by side with Attic olives and figs. For Athenians, eating at the market was not just about survival. It was about connecting to the larger world beyond Greece. And then there were the smells. Smoke rising from fish grills mixed with the sweetness of honey cakes. The sharp tang of pickled olives mingled with the earthy scent of lentils bubbling in clay pots. For the citizen, soldier, slave, or philosopher passing through, the market was an irresistible sensory assault, a reminder that in Athens, food was never far from reach. The agora's markets were more than commerce. They were theater, politics, and survival wrapped into one. To walk through them was to experience Athens at its most human. In Athens, food was never just about filling the stomach. It was about connection between families, neighbors, classes, and even the gods themselves. Meals, whether taken at home in the bustling agora or at religious festivals, served as the glue that held the city together. For the ordinary Athenian, eating was communal. Families gathered around simple clay tables, sharing barley bread, olives, and lentil stew from common bowls. Nothing was wasted, and eating was as much about conversation and storytelling as about nourishment. Even the poorest laborer could find dignity in breaking bread with his kin. To eat alone was rare and often seen as joyless, a reminder that food was meant to be shared. On the streets, the same principle extended outward. Vendors sold roasted chickpeas or grilled sardines, not to silent customers, but to people who lingered, chatted, and argued as they ate. A dock worker might share figs with a friend, while two philosophers debated politics over watered wine at a corner stand. The marketplace became a stage where Athenians of all ranks, from slaves to citizens, brushed shoulders and connected through food. Religious life reinforced this sense of unity. At festivals, sacrificial meat was divided among participants, allowing even the poor to taste what they normally could not afford. Honey cakes offered to the gods were later shared among worshippers, blurring the line between sacred offering and public feast. Food in this context was not private. It was civic, binding the community together in ritual and celebration. Even politics had its place at the table. Public meals known as syssitia, especially in other Greek city-states like Sparta, found their Athenian echoes in communal feasting after victories or during great civic events. Here, food became a statement of equality, citizens dining together, setting aside rank for the shared act of eating. And of course there were the symposia, drinking gatherings where men reclined, talked, sang, and plotted the ideas that would shape philosophy, drama, and politics for centuries. Though these were elite affairs, their roots were still in the Athenian belief that food and drink opened doors to fellowship and intellectual exchange. In the end, Athenian street food was more than chickpeas, honey cakes, or grilled fish. It was the taste of democracy in action. Simple meals shared across divides, turning daily survival into a ritual of belonging. Through food, Athens fed not just its body, but its soul. The story of Vinland begins not with Leif Erikson, but with his father, Eric the Red. Fierce, ambitious, and exiled more than once for violence, Eric had carved out a life on the very edge of the known world. After being banished from Iceland, he set sail further west and stumbled upon Greenland, a land of glaciers, fjords, and harsh winds. To entice settlers, he named it Greenland, though the reality was far less inviting. Here, in scattered turf houses clinging to the coasts, the Norse carved out a fragile existence, hunting seals, tending sheep, and trading furs. Leif grew up in this world of scarcity. Unlike the lush fields of Norway, Greenland demanded toughness and ingenuity. Every harvest was uncertain, every winter a trial. From his father, Leif inherited not only boldness, but also the conviction that survival lay beyond the horizon. Eric had turned exile into opportunity. Leif would do the same. But whispers reached Greenland of something more, a land westward, beyond the icy seas. Sailors spoke of forests where timber grew thick, unlike the barren rock of Greenland. Some even claimed to have glimpsed wild grapes, a bounty unimaginable in the frozen north. These were not idle tavern tales. Norse seafarers were practical men, and Leif listened closely. If the rumors were true, this land could provide what Greenland could not: resources for survival, expansion, and perhaps even glory. Leif's world was already shaped by voyages. Norse ships carried not just warriors, but settlers and families across the Atlantic. From Norway to Iceland, from Iceland to Greenland. Each step further west was a gamble, but one the Norse had made before. Why stop at Greenland if richer shores lay just beyond? The sea, after all, was not a barrier for Leif's people. It was a road. By the year 1000, Leif Erikson was ready. Strong, ambitious, and hungry for discovery. He gathered his crew. His father, Eric, though proud, was aging and cautious, warning of storms and unknown dangers. But Leif was not deterred. He had grown up on stories of sagas, of men who pushed past fear into legend. For him, sailing west was not just curiosity, it was destiny. And so, with Greenland's icy fjords at his back, Leif set his sights on the horizon. What awaited him was not just another settlement, but the beginning of one of history's greatest tales of discovery, the land that would come to be called Vinland. In the year 1000 CE, Leif Erikson made ready for a journey that even his bold father had hesitated to attempt. He gathered a crew of about 35 men, hardened farmers, hunters, and sailors, who knew the moods of the North Atlantic all too well. They were not adventurers, chasing glory alone. They were men of necessity, accustomed to hunger, cold, and danger. To them, the promise of new land was as much survival as it was exploration. Their ship was a NAR, a broad-bellied cargo vessel built for ocean crossings. Unlike the sleek, dragon-prowed long ships of raiders, the NAR was steady, able to carry livestock, timber, and trade goods. Its oak planks flexed with the waves, and its single square sail of wool dyed red and brown caught the northern winds. Each man knew the rigging, the oars, and the rhythm of the sea. With their provisions of dried fish, seal meat, butter, and ale, they pushed westward, chasing the edge of the known world. Navigation was part science, part instinct. The Norse had no maps of these western seas. Instead, they read the sun's path, the flight of birds, the smell of salt and seaweed, even the color of water against the hull. At night, they looked to the stars, fixing their course by the North Star, and constellations passed down through memory. Some sagas suggest that Leif carried with him a sunstone, a crystal that revealed the sun's position even on cloudy days. Whether legend or truth, such tools symbolize the ingenuity of Norse seafarers. The voyage was no calm passage. The North Atlantic could turn savage in moments. Winds tore at the sail, waves crashed over the deck, and icebergs drifted silently in the mist. The men bailed water, lashed themselves to the ship, and sang to keep fear at bay. Each morning they scanned the horizon, hoping for a glimpse of the land they had heard whispered in stories. Days stretched into weeks, and doubt crept in. Was there truly a fertile coast beyond Greenland? Or were they chasing ghosts? Yet Leif's confidence never wavered. He believed the sea was not emptiness, but a pathway. When at last the gulls began to circle overhead, and the scent of earth drifted on the wind, the crew's doubts turned to awe. Ahead lay a new shore, untouched and waiting. This was not just landfall. It was the moment when legend began to harden into history. At first, it appeared as a faint smudge against the endless gray horizon. The men squinted into the spray, unsure if it was another bank of mist or the dream they had chased for weeks. As the Inar drew closer, the blur sharpened into a coastline, rolling hills, dense forests, and a stretch of untouched shoreline that looked nothing like the icy barrens of Greenland. Voices rose in disbelief and wonder. Here was proof that the stories were true. There was land beyond the Western Sea. The North sagas described the scene with reverence. Instead of glaciers and rocky cliffs, they found soft earth, thick woodlands, and meadows that promised pasture for animals. The beaches gave way to forests so dense that sunlight struggled to pierce their canopy. For men accustomed to the treeless wastess of Greenland, it was as if they had stumbled upon an earthly paradise. They steered the ship toward a sheltered bay and brought the NAR to shore. Leif was the first to step onto the soil, his boots sinking into rich earth around him. His crew fanned out, marveling at the abundance. Streams of fresh water trickled down from hills, cool and clear. Birds filled the air with their cries, and wild game rustled through the underbrush. The men drank, ate what they could gather, and for the first time in weeks felt the comfort of a land that seemed generous rather than hostile. What struck them most, according to the sagas, were the wild vines heavy with grapes. The Norse were no strangers to wine, but in Greenland and Iceland, such luxuries were unheard of. Here, grapes grew freely, and the men eagerly picked them, staining their hands and mouths purple. To Leif, this abundance gave the land its name, Vinland, the land of wine. Whether the berries were truly grapes or another fruit misnamed by the Norse, their discovery became a symbol of plenty. As they explored further, they found tall trees, timber of a quality long denied to them in Greenland. Wood was life for building homes, repairing ships, and heating through brutal winters. To see forests stretching to the horizon was to glimpse wealth beyond measure. That evening, as the sun sank over this new shore, the men built fires and feasted. For the first time in generations, Norsemen felt they had found not just survival, but possibility. Vinland was no myth. It was real, and it was theirs to explore. After the first night on Vinland's shores, the men awoke with the cautious excitement of pioneers. This was no longer just a voyage. It was the beginning of something new. Leif Erikson, mindful of both opportunity and danger, divided his crew into small groups to explore. Some stayed to guard the ship, while others fanned into the forests and along the rivers, eager to see what this land could offer. The The Saras tell us they found resources beyond anything Greenland could provide. Forests stretched in every direction, offering timber strong enough for houses and ships. Streams teemed with salmon so fat and plentiful that men could catch them by hand. Meadows provided open pasture, perfect for grazing if settlers ever brought cattle here. The air itself seemed gentler, the winters shorter, though perhaps this was just the relief of men weary of ice and rock. They built a small camp of turf houses and wooden structures, temporary shelters that allowed them to endure the nights in safety. Fires burned in the hearths, their smoke curling into the air as proof that Norse hands had claimed yet another land. From these houses, Leif organized expeditions deeper inland, ensuring that no corner of the coastline was left unexamined. One group discovered a grove heavy with wild berries, not only the grapes that had inspired the name Vinland, but also blueberries and cranberries, which stained their hands and filled their sacks. Another group found hills rich with game, deer, and perhaps even elk that moved through the woods with little fear of man. The Norse hunters knew at once that this was land that could sustain life for generations. Each evening, the explorers returned to camp with their findings. They roasted fish, feasted on berries, and praised the land's generosity. The mood among the crew shifted from doubt to hope. They spoke not only of survival, but of settlement. For men hardened by Greenland's scarcity, Vinland was a dream of abundance made real. Yet Leif urged caution. He knew the sea was treacherous and the land unpredictable. They were not the first to set foot here. He suspected others, perhaps native peoples, might already claim it. For now, though, Vinland remained theirs to explore, a land both wild and welcoming, waiting to test whether Norse ambition could truly take root so far from home. For weeks, Leif Erikson and his crew enjoyed the bounty of Vinland. They fished its rivers, hunted its game, and gathered its berries. But the Norse knew well that no land, however fertile, was ever truly empty. Sooner or later they expected to find others, whether friend or foe. And in time they did. The sagas describe the first inhabitants the Norse encountered as the Skrælings, a term used for the native peoples they met in both Greenland and Vinland. To the Norse eye, the Skrælings were unfamiliar, shorter in stature, dressed in hides, skilled with bows and arrows, and quick-moving across the land. Their language was strange, their customs alien. But what mattered most was how these two groups, separated by oceans and worlds of culture, would deal with one another. At first, the encounters were cautious. The Norse showed goods such as red cloth, metal tools, and milk, things unknown to the Skrælings. In return, the natives offered pelts, animal skins, and food. For a brief time, it seemed possible that trade might flourish. The Norse prized furs, and the Skrælings were intrigued by woven cloth and iron. Around the fires of their turf houses, Leif's men dreamed of a future where Vinland could be both a colony and a trading hub. But mistrust grew quickly. The Norse, though hardy farmers and sailors, were also warriors by heritage. They carried weapons and were not afraid to use them. The Skrælings, wary of the strangers with iron swords, began to see them as intruders. Conflict sparked suddenly. Arrows loosed at Norsemen in the woods, a clash over trade gone wrong, shouts in languages neither side could understand. The sagas tell of one particularly fierce skirmish, where the Skrælings attacked in numbers, driving the Norse back to their settlement. Arrows whistled, stones flew, and the Vinland camp trembled with chaos. The Norse fought back, shields raised, swords flashing, but they realized a grim truth. They were too few, and the land was not theirs alone. Though Leif sought peace where possible, these clashes made it clear that Vinland, however rich, was contested ground. The grapes, the timber, the salmon, all were tempting. But so long as the Skrælings defended their homeland, any Norse foothold would be fragile. What began as a voyage of discovery was turning into a lesson. The Atlantic had delivered them to new shores. But survival here depended not only on nature's bounty, but on how they faced the people who already called this land home. Once Leif Erikson and his men established their camp, Vinland became more than just a distant coastline. It became a lived reality. The Norse were not merely explorers. They were settlers at heart, accustomed to carving homes out of hostile landscapes, In Vinland, they built a small but sturdy base, likely of turf walls and timber roofs, much like the dwellings in Greenland. Smoke from their hearths curled above the camp, a sign that Norse hands were shaping this wild land into something familiar. Daily life followed a rhythm of survival and opportunity. At dawn, men set out to fish the rivers and streams where salmon leapt in such numbers that catching them seemed almost effortless. Others hunted game, deer, bear, and waterfowl, returning with meat that was roasted on open fires or preserved for leaner days. The forest provided nuts and berries, while the grassy clearings suggested potential fields for grazing livestock should future settlers arrive. Food, however, was not their only concern. Timber was perhaps Vinland's greatest treasure. Greenland settlers were starved of wood, forced to build with stone and turf. Here, forests stretched endlessly, offering logs for ships, houses, and tools. Crews felled trees, shaping them with axes, stockpiling planks and beams. Some of this lumber was destined not for Vinland itself, but for Greenland, resources to be fed back across the ocean. Life in the settlement was not without hardship. The winters, though milder than Greenland's, were still biting, and provisions had to be carefully managed. Firewood was cut and stacked, stores of fish and meat salted or dried. Norse discipline forged by years of survival on harsher shores kept the camp organized. Evenings were quieter. Men gathered around the hearth telling tales of their homelands or speculating about Vinland's future. Could families be brought here? Could farms thrive? Some dreamed of a permanent colony, a place where Norse children could grow among vines and forests instead of ice and rock. Others, more cautious, saw Vinland as a seasonal outpost, a place to gather timber and resources before returning east. What united them all was the sense of standing at the edge of possibility. Vinland was unlike any land they had known, generous, fertile, yet uncertain. Around their fires, Lee's men lived as pioneers, half in the present, half dreaming of what might be built upon these western shores. For a time, life in Vinland seemed promising. The Norse had food, timber, and shelter, and Leif Erikson's crew began to imagine futures rooted in this new land. Yet beneath the surface, tension grew. The Skrælings, the native people who already called Vinland home, had tolerated the strangers for a while, but suspicion and resentment began to rise. The Norse saw the land as empty for the taking. The Skrælings saw invaders cutting their trees, hunting their game, and planting their fires along the shore. At first, interactions were cautious exchanges. The Norse offered red cloth, milk, or iron tools, which fascinated the Skrælings, while they, in turn, traded animal pelts and food. But these fragile beginnings soured quickly. The Norse, proud and martial, carried weapons, even to trade. Their warriors' presence was a constant reminder that their friendship rested on the edge of a sword. One saga tells of a skirmish sparked when a bull belonging to the Norse bellowed and frightened the Skrælings, who retaliated in fear. Another account describes a trade dispute, perhaps over milk or cloth, that erupted into violence. Whatever the spark, arrows flew, stones were hurled, and soon the Norse camp found itself under siege. The Skrælings came in numbers. They moved swiftly, their arrows raining down from a distance, forcing the Norse to raise shields in tight formations. The Norse countered with iron swords and axes, weapons that could cleave through bone and wood, but they were few, and each loss struck deeply. For every Norseman who fell, the survival of the whole settlement was threatened. The sagas highlight moments of desperation and bravery. Women in the camp carried water and urged the men to fight harder, while warriors charged out with wild cries to scatter the attackers. In some tellings, even a pregnant woman, Freyas, daughter of Eric the Red, picked up a sword, baring her chest and screaming at the Skrælings until they retreated in shock. Though the Norse won some clashes, they could not escape the truth. They were outsiders in a land already defended. Every arrow fired by the Skrælings reminded them that Vinland, for all its bounty, was not theirs to claim without cost. The dream of a peaceful colony gave way to the grim reality of a frontier bristling with hostility. Vinland's abundance was undeniable, but so too was its danger. The promise of Vinland was undeniable. Fertile soil, thick forests, rivers brimming with fish, and vines heavy with fruit. Yet as months passed, Leif Erikson's men realized that abundance alone could not guarantee survival. The Skraelings resisted their presence with determination, and every clash reminded the Norse of how precarious their settlement truly was. Vinland was rich, but it was also contested ground. The Norse were few. 35 men, even armed with iron and discipline, could not stand indefinitely against larger numbers who knew the land intimately. Hunting trips became dangerous, as arrows sometimes whistled from the tree. Trade had broken down, replaced by suspicion and ambushes. The men could not sleep without keeping watch, and the once hopeful fireside talk of farms and families turned into uneasy whispers of retreat. Practicality weighed heavily. The Norse were not dreamers detached from reality. They were survivors. Their ancestors had crossed oceans, carved homes into Iceland's lava fields, and braved Greenland's ice. But they had always known when to press on and when to fall back. Vinland's timber and resources were valuable, yes, but permanent settlement seemed impossible with hostile neighbors, and such a small force to defend it. The sagas tell us that Leif, though unwilling to abandon Vinland's promise, recognized the wisdom of caution. He and his men began preparing to leave. They harvested grapes, cut timber, and loaded their NAR with as much bounty as it could carry. The ship became a floating treasure chest of Vinland's riches, proof that the land was real and fertile, even if it could not yet be held. Their departure was tinged with regret. Some men wanted to stay longer, to fight harder, to stake a permanent claim. Others were relieved to turn their backs on a land that seemed to promise blood as much as plenty. Ultimately, the decision reflected the Norse ethos: survival above all else. To return alive with stories and resources was better than to die in a futile defense of distant shores. As the NAR pushed off from Vinland's coast, the men looked back at the forests fading into the horizon. They had found a new world, yet could not keep it. The Atlantic would carry them home, but the memory of Vinland, its grapes, its woods, and its dangers would remain carved into their sagas. When Leif Erikson and his crew returned across the Atlantic, they carried with them more than timber and tales of grapes. They carried the memory of a new world, a place that stretched the imagination of what lay beyond the horizon. Vinland, though never fully settled, became a story told around hearths in Greenland, Iceland, and Norway. A story of opportunity, danger, and lands richer than any known in the north. The sagas that recorded these voyages, the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red, preserved Vinland in legend. They told of Leif, the lucky who brought back not just timber, but proof that the Atlantic concealed fertile shores. They spoke of Karl Safan, another would-be settler who tried to establish a colony, but was also driven back by the Skraelings. Each retelling kept Vinland alive, half memory, half myth. For centuries, Vinland hovered on the edge of credibility. To many in medieval Europe, the idea that Norsemen had reached a land far west of Greenland seemed fanciful. The story persisted in Icelandic tradition, but was little known elsewhere. Then, in modern times, evidence began to surface. The excavation at Lono Meadows in Newfoundland revealed turf houses unmistakably Norse in design, confirming what the sagas had whispered all along. The Vikings had reached North America around the year 1000, nearly 500 years before Columbus. The legacy of Vinland is twofold. On one hand, it showed the extraordinary reach of North seamanship. These were not merely raiders of Europe's coasts, but explorers who crossed oceans and touched new continents. On the other hand, Vinland became a reminder of limits. The Norse had found new shores, but they lacked the numbers and the alliances to hold them. Unlike Greenland or Iceland, Vinland never became a lasting colony. Yet, in a way, its greatest legacy lies in imagination. For the Norse, Vinland was proof that the world was larger than they had thought, that beyond every horizon lay the possibility of more. For later generations, the Vinland sagas became a prelude to the age of exploration, a whisper that the Atlantic had already been crossed long before Columbus. Leif Erikson's journey did not change the world immediately, but it ensured that the first footsteps of Europe in the Americas were not Spanish, but Norse. And that memory carried in saga and soil remains Vinland's enduring gift too.